Hello, this is Mink, and today's story goes back to a time when both the women's movement and the civil rights movement intersected. It is the story about the career girl murders. Now, this story has been told before, but it has an eerie connection that fits right in today's fight for racial equality and justice. So let's set the scene. It was August 28th, 1963. Important that you remember that date. It was a pleasant summer day in Upper Manhattan, and it was in the 70s. And it was a great time, like I said, of change for both women and the civil rights movement. Women who had previously been groomed for marriage and motherhood were just gaining their independence. It was still a relatively conservative era where young women were to be protected. So when these three girlfriends lived in an apartment in Manhattan, they were part of a new class of working women on their own. Emily Hofford and Pat Tullis were both 23, and they had been friends since college. Janice Wiley was 21, and her family, Pat's family, and her family were friends. Janice had just moved out with the other girls 3 weeks prior to the murders, and they were all very lucky enough to find an affordable 5-room apartment at 57 East 88th Street on the 3rd floor. That was the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and it was the apartment of 3 single girls who hosted gatherings, had dates, and had dreams for their future. Pat and Janice both worked for Newsweek magazine, which was a literal physical magazine in those days. And Pat had met up with Janice the first day she worked there. And they were both assigned to call what was called the clip desk. They wore smocks and they sat in small groups at a table. And they were armed with tools like grease pencils and rulers that they called ripsticks. And they clipped out newspaper articles from all over and sent them to the right departments so they could be researched to see if they would write articles about them. Pat was very reliable, sophisticated, and when Janice did not show up for work that day, nobody was surprised. She was considered a party girl. Emily Hofford, who was Pat's friend from school, had just finished her master's degree in English from Tufts University. She had just gotten a job as a teacher on Long Island, and she had been gone throughout the summer with her family. She had just gotten back into town to get her things out of that apartment because she'd got a cheaper apartment in Murray Hill, also an area of Manhattan, but closer to the East River. She was moving that very day, as a matter of fact, and she had been making several trips back and forth between the apartments with her belongings. Now, she was different than the other 2 women. She was a bespectacled girl that was much smaller than the others, and the media referred to her a lot as plain. Janice, on the other hand, was this leggy blonde woman who was like 5'6", with the ambitions of being an actress. She was born to a life in privilege and was a New York City native, so she was sophisticated and exciting. And even though she was known as a party girl, she had trained at the neighborhood Playhouse School Theater and was in over 20 productions. She also was flirtatious with men, she dated often, and she hosted gatherings at the apartment. Now that night, Pat came home about 6:40 p.m., and when she entered the apartment, she noticed something was off. She walked through the apartment, and as she passed by the bathroom, she saw a bloody knife on the bathroom sink. She glanced into Janice's bedroom and saw that the room had been ransacked and the mattress was pulled to the side. She got this horrible feelings and ran out of the apartment. Now, in those days, there were hall phones because not every individual apartment had them, so they were outside. So from that hall phone, she called Janice's parents, who lived actually a couple of blocks down at 55 East 88th Street. And then she left the building, frantic. She was pacing around, pacing outside. Finally, she came back in and stayed in the hall outside of the apartment. Janice Wiley's family, they were famous. Philip Wiley was a well-known author, and he was Janice's uncle. He wrote novels, science fiction works, serials, articles, even newspaper columns, and social commentary. An interesting side note is that his daughter, Karen Pryor, invented something called the Animal Clicker Training Program. That's where they give a command and click, and then when the dog does it, they give him a treat. She invented that. Back to the story, Janice's father was Max Wiley. He was an advertising exec in the days of Mad Men. He also wrote screenplays, and he was a creator of The Flying Nun, which is a famous TV show in the 60s, starring Sally Field. Now, Sally Field went on to be an Academy Award-winning actress for Norma Ray. She is also famous for delivering the line, "You like me, you really like me," as she received her Oscar statue. Now, when Janice's parents arrived, and they were there within minutes, Max Wiley told the women to stay in the hall as he checked out the apartment. As he went into Janice's room, he discovered the two girls behind the wall, between the wall and the bed. They had been brutally murdered. They were bound at the wrist by strips of torn bed sheets. It was clear they were both dead. Janice, with her hair still in curlers, was stabbed to death, and Emily was bludgeoned, and her throat was cut from ear to ear. Bludgeoned, that's the word, sorry. So Max went outside, and he had the horrible task of telling Pat and his wife that both women were dead. He immediately phoned the police, and then equally had the gruesome task of notifying Emily's family. Emily's family was from Minnesota. Her father was a prominent Minneapolis surgeon, and she was a studious girl putting education before romance. And as I said, she was viewed by the press as not as glamorous as her roommates. And she had been moving out that morning, as she, like I said, had found an apartment in Murray Hill. It is thought that during her trips back and forth, she interrupted the murder in progress, which resulted in her being killed. In 1963, when you needed the police, you called the precinct to get the police to come out to a crime scene. There was no 911 service. It would take the murder of Kitty Genovese the following year before that process would begin. So within minutes, the cops were swarming the crime scene. This was the Upper East Side, the Gold Coast of Manhattan. Now, there was a show on the ID channel called A Crime to Remember, which covered this story, I think, like the second episode in the first year. The show revealed that in this area was so rich that if a dog were lost, 15 cops would show up to look for it. So when the police showed up at this crime scene, they knew there would be pressure and that this case was going to be high profile. When the crime scene was investigated, it was discovered that Janice had been anally assaulted and the killer had used Noxzema skin cream for lubricant. He also left semen, but at that point, DNA testing was not available. The two women were bound and then bound together with a chenille bedspread. Janice had been repeatedly stabbed and eviscerated with her intestines outside of her body. Emily was hacked with a knife and her throat slit. There was a broken soda pop bottle and 2 kitchen knives that had had their blades broken right off in the bedroom at the scene. And a wall clock was pulled out of the wall and the cord wrapped around Emily's neck. Janice was naked and Emily was fully clothed. It is the reason that the police believe Emily walked in on the murder scene. There was a bedroom window open also, but the cops dismissed it as a point of entry at that time because they were on the 3rd floor. For months, the investigation went on, and over 1,500 people were interviewed. Since Emily went to school in Canada for a time, even the Canadian authorities got involved. Newsweek magazine offered up a reward of $10,000 to catch the killer, and the police were under enormous pressure. They even went as far as to involve Scotland Yard in Britain, as there was this handsome British journalist who made the scene, who was kind of a ladies' man, and he became a person of interest. Beat cops were constantly watching for anything that could lead them to finding this brutal killer. And it was during this period that police officer Frank Isola came upon George Whitmore. As Isola was patrolling one night, he saw Whitmore in an area of an attempted rape. It was on that night a nurse named Elba Borrow called the police as somebody had tried to rape her, like I said. Now, when Isola saw this man, he fired 4 shots into the air to scare him off. Later, he came upon that same man, Whitmore, loitering. When questioned him, Whitmore told the cop he was waiting for his brother. The next morning, Isola came across Whitmore again, but this time he took him into custody. They questioned Whitmore for 26 hours. He was 19, skinny, with a pimply face. And by the time the interrogation was over, he admitted he had murdered the 2 career girls, Janice Wiley and Emily Hofford. The police were quoted as saying things like, "No question about it, we got the right guy." And he knew details only the killer could have known. Whitmore, on the other hand, recanted his confession almost immediately. He accused the police of telling him what to say. He identified a photo of Janice that turned out not to even be her. There are witnesses, too, that say Whitmore was 150 miles away from the crime scene that day, but that's hearsay. Also, a new suspect after a few months turned up, and his name was Richard Robles. Now, Robles was known to the cops as he was a junkie named and a cat burglar named Babyface Bandit, and he was out on parole at the time of the murders. He had been a junkie since he was in his early teenage years, about 13, and had bragged to people that he'd done over 100 burglaries. He also assaulted women and tied them up. Now, a fellow drug addict named Nathan Delaney told the cops they had the wrong man, but that was 1964, so months later, even a year later. Delaney said that Robles had come over to his house and told him that he needed a fix real bad, that he had just killed 2 women. Robles picked the apartment, he said, because he thought it was empty, and he was surprised to see Janice there, so he assaulted her. And then Emily returned to the apartment, and he tied them up together. Emily had made the mistake of telling Robles, "I'm going to remember you for the police. You're going to jail." So he killed them. Delaney agreed to have taped conversation with Robles that aided the prosecution when Robles went to trial in 1965. He also confessed to Detective David Downs. He said, "I went to pull a lousy burglary and I wound up killing 2 girls." In January 1966, Robles was given 2 concurrent life sentences for the murders. He has been eligible for parole since the 1980s, but was finally released on parole during the COVID shutdown, May of 2020. Robles served 53 years. Now back to George Whitmore, the black man arrested, was exonerated, and released. That didn't fix everything, though, because Whitmore continued to have legal issues. He was convicted of an attempted rape against Borio. His case was instrumental in ending, though, the death penalty for murder in New York, and his case was also cited in Miranda versus Arizona ruling to protect civil rights, that thing that they do when they arrest criminals or potential criminals, when they say you have the right to remain silent. It would be another 10 years before Whitmore was cleared of the charge of rape. He was awarded $500,000 by the courts for pain and suffering and died at 68 in a nursing home. Now, that same day that Janice Wiley and Emily Hofford were murdered, Martin Luther King was in Washington, D.C. He was giving his famous speech during the March on Washington. Remember that date, August 28, 1963? Martin Luther King delivered the I Have a Dream speech during his fight for civil rights. It was completely ironic that an innocent black man would be interrogated for 26 hours, coerced into a false confession that destroyed the next 10 years of his life, and I'm sure had ramifications of PTSD way beyond that. Even Isola's statement belied a racial prejudice when he saw a black man rush toward Borio. The true murderer turned out to be a white junkie that was trying to steal to pay for drugs. In 1993, Robles answered some questions for a reporter at the New York Post. He stated he'd started using drugs at about 14 after his parents separated and the death of his older brother Michael in a military training exercise in Kentucky. His brother was his hero. Robles said he was bullied because of his Spanish heritage, and because of addiction, he was only briefly in high school. He had just been released from serving a 3-year prison sentence in August 1963. He was helping his unemployed girlfriend support their 3-year-old child. He had come out of the penitentiary and he had renounced crime, but he was going to do one more burglary to get money for them. He said he came into the window and Janice saw him. That is when the burglary went south. And when Emily said she would tell the police on him, Robles said he just went bananas. He broke 2 knives, killing them and beating them with a soda bottle. Now, within 5 years of the murder, Max Wiley, creator of Flying Nun, would lose his wife to cancer and another daughter to pneumonia. So when he went into that Fredericksburg, Virginia motel 12 years later and shot himself, I am certain that he had had enough. This is Trish Mink, and that was the Career Girl Murders. Only one of the many stories of the 20th century. So have a good one.